The smell of burnt paper is something I will never forget for as long as I live. It was a cold Tuesday morning in our small village of Oakhaven when my dreams turned into gray flakes of ash. I stood in the middle of our cramped kitchen, staring at the fireplace where my older stepbrother, Silas, was warming his hands. In his right hand, he held the remains of a thick, cream-colored envelope that had arrived only an hour ago. It was the official admission letter from the National University of Excellence, the only thing I had worked for since I was 6 years old. My name, Elara Vance, was still visible on a small corner of the charred paper before it crumbled into the flames. Silas looked at me with a twisted smile that made my stomach turn into knots. He didn't look sorry at all. He looked like he had just won a grand prize. "Girls like you don't need to go to the big city, Elara," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "You belong here, scrubbing these floors and making sure my dinner is ready when I come home from the fields." I felt like the world had stopped spinning under my feet. I reached into the fire, trying to save even a small piece of the letter, but the heat scorched my fingertips. I pulled my hand back, tears stinging my eyes like sharp needles. That letter was more than just paper to me. It was my golden ticket out of a life of constant labor and silence. My father had passed away 3 years ago, leaving me in the care of my stepmother, Martha, and her biological son, Silas. Ever since the funeral, they had treated me like a servant in my own home. I did the laundry, I cooked the heavy meals, and I tended to the goats while Silas spent his days gambling at the village square. My father had left a small savings account specifically for my university education, but Silas had been trying to find the access key for months. He knew that if I went to the university, the money would be legally mine to control. By burning the letter, he thought he was burning my future and keeping that money for himself. He laughed as he kicked the last of the ash into the grate, leaving me standing there in total silence. "You think you are better than us because you can read big books?" Silas spat, stepping closer to me until his shadow covered my entire body. He was a large man, built from years of eating the best portions of food while I survived on scraps. "Mother and I have decided. You will stay here and marry the blacksmith's son, Amos, by the end of the month. He has offered a good price for you, and that money will help me fix the roof and buy new cattle." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Marrying Amos meant I would never leave Oakhaven. It meant I would spend the rest of my life in a different kitchen, doing the same chores until I grew old and tired. I looked at Silas with a spark of anger he had never seen before. "I am not a goat to be sold at the market, Silas," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and fury. He simply raised his hand as if to strike me, causing me to flinch and move back toward the door. "You are whatever I say you are," he roared. That night, I sat on my thin straw mat in the small shed behind the main house. Martha had moved me out of my bedroom months ago to make room for Silas's extra boots and hunting gear. The shed was cold, and the wind whistled through the cracks in the wooden walls, but it was the only place where I could be alone with my thoughts. I thought about the dean of the university, a man named Dr. Alistair Thorne, who had visited our village school a year ago. He had seen my test scores and told me I was the brightest student he had encountered in a decade. He had promised me that the university would look out for me. But how could they help me now? They would think I had simply ignored their offer. I had no phone, no internet, and no way to send a letter without Silas intercepting it at the local post office. I felt completely trapped, like a fly caught in a thick spiderweb. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flames licking the edges of my admission letter. The next morning, Martha came to the shed and kicked my feet to wake me up. "Get up, lazy girl," she grumbled, her face pinched in its usual expression of annoyance. "There is water to be fetched and the garden needs weeding before the sun gets too high." I stood up, my muscles aching from the cold floor. As I walked to the well, I saw Silas talking to Amos, the blacksmith's son, near the front gate. Amos was a mean-spirited man who enjoyed throwing rocks at the village dogs. Seeing them together made the reality of my situation sink in deeper. They were discussing the price for my life as if they were talking about a bag of grain. I gripped the handle of the wooden bucket until my knuckles turned white. I knew I couldn't just sit there and let them destroy me. I had to find a way to let the university know what was happening. But Silas watched me constantly, and the village was small enough that everyone reported back to him. Days turned into a week of misery. Silas became even greedier, demanding that I hand over my father's old silver watch, the only thing I had left of him. "I need to sell it to pay my debts," Silas demanded one evening during dinner. I had hidden the watch inside a hollowed-out stone near the river where I washed our clothes. I lied and told him I had lost it in the fields. He didn't believe me and threw his heavy plate across the room, shattering it against the wall. "If I don't find that watch or get that bank key by Friday, you won't like what happens next," he threatened. Martha sat there quietly, nodding in agreement with her son. She didn't care about me at all. She only cared about the comfort Silas could provide with my father's wealth. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my education anymore. I was fighting for my very survival. They were willing to strip me of everything until I was nothing but a ghost in their house. I realized that Silas had made one huge mistake. He assumed that because he burned the letter, the record of my admission was gone forever. He didn't understand how the world outside Oakhaven worked. He thought paper was the only truth. On Thursday, I was sent to the market to sell some of Martha's knitted blankets. It was my only chance to speak to someone outside the family. I saw my old school teacher, Mr. Gable, sitting at a small bench near the fruit stalls. He was a kind man who had always encouraged my studies. I had to be careful. Silas's friend, Bram, was standing only 20 feet away, watching the crowd. I pretended to browse the apples near Mr. Gable and whispered as loudly as I dared. "Mr. Gable, Silas burned my letter. He is trying to force me to marry Amos and take my father's money. Please, you have to help me." Mr. Gable looked shocked, his eyes widening behind his thick glasses. He didn't say a word, but he gave a small, firm nod. Bram started walking toward us, and I immediately moved away, pretending to haggle over the price of a cabbage. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst through my chest. Had Mr. Gable understood me? Would he be able to do anything? He was just a village teacher, and Silas was a powerful, terrifying figure in our local community. I finished my errands and walked home, the heavy basket of unsold blankets weighing down my arms. When I returned, Silas was waiting for me at the door. He grabbed my arm and twisted it slightly. "Who were you talking to at the market, Elara?" "Bram says you were lingering near the old teacher." I looked down at the dirt, trying to keep my face neutral. I was just asking if he wanted to buy a blanket, Silas. He said no. Silas shoved me toward the kitchen. Don't get any ideas. Tomorrow is Friday. The blacksmith is coming with the papers for the marriage. Friday morning arrived with a heavy fog that draped over the village like a funeral shroud. I stayed in the shed, praying for a miracle but expecting the worst. Around noon, I heard the sound of a heavy horse-drawn carriage and the clinking of metal. Amos had arrived with his father and the village elder to witness the signing of the marriage contract. Silas was dressed in his best coat, looking smug and triumphant. Martha was serving tea and honey cakes, acting like this was a joyous occasion. I was dragged into the main room, my hair messy and my dress stained from work. Sign the paper, Elara, the village elder said, placing a quill in my hand. It is the wish of your guardians. I looked at Silas, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He mouthed the words, "The watch," to me, a final threat. I held the quill over the paper, my hand shaking so hard I couldn't write. I felt like I was signing my own death warrant. Just as the quill touched the parchment, a strange sound echoed through the quiet village air. It wasn't the sound of a carriage or a horse, it was the loud, rhythmic thumping of an engine. In 2026, technology had reached even the outskirts of the mountains, but we rarely saw official vehicles in Oakhaven. Two black SUVs with blue and red flashing lights tore through the village fog, screeching to a halt right in front of our gate. The dust kicked up by the tires covered the porch. Everyone inside the room froze. Silas stood up straight, his face turning a pale shade of green. Through the window, we saw 4 men in dark blue police uniforms step out, followed by an older man in a sharp, gray suit. He carried a leather briefcase and walked with the authority of a king. My breath hitched in my throat. I recognized that face from the school assembly a year ago. It was Dr. Alastair Thorne, the dean of the university. The front door was kicked open before Silas could even reach the handle. The lead police officer stepped inside, his hand resting on his belt. "Is there an Elara Vance in this house?" he asked, his voice booming through the small room. I stood up, dropping the quill onto the floor. "I am Elara," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. Dr. Thorne stepped forward, pushing past the stunned village elder. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the tea, the honey cakes, and the marriage contract on the table. He then looked at Silas and Martha, his expression turning into one of pure ice. "We received a very disturbing message from a Mr. Gable," Dr. Thorne said, opening his briefcase. He informed us that a certain high-achieving student was being held against her will and that her official university documents had been destroyed by her relatives. Silas tried to laugh it off, though his voice cracked. "It's just a family matter, sir. The girl is confused. She doesn't want to go to school." "Confused?" Dr. Thorne repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He pulled out a fresh, identical cream-colored envelope from his bag. Elara Vance was awarded a full presidential scholarship, including a living stipend that is legally her property. Interference with government-sponsored education grants is a federal crime. And as for the destruction of official university correspondence, that carries a mandatory prison sentence. The police officer stepped toward Silas. "We also have reports of attempted financial fraud regarding a deceased man's estate. Silas Vance, we have a warrant to inspect your recent banking attempts and your treatment of this minor. Martha shrieked and dropped her teacup, the porcelain shattering on the floor. Amos and his father quickly backed away toward the door, trying to distance themselves from the disaster. Silas tried to bolt for the back exit, but the other officers were already waiting there. They grabbed him by the arms and slammed him against the wall, the same wall where he had shattered my plate only nights before. The sight of Silas in handcuffs was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He struggled and cursed, his face turning red with anger and shame. "You can't do this. This is my house," he screamed. The officer didn't listen. He read Silas his rights while the other officers began questioning Martha. I stood there, watching my nightmare crumble in real time. Dr. Thorne walked over to me and handed me the new letter. "I am so sorry we didn't get here sooner, Elara," he said gently. "Mr. Gable told us everything. He said you were a lioness fighting for your life." I took the letter, my fingers tracing the embossed seal of the university. This time, there was no fire to take it away. I looked at the dean and then at the police. "He tried to force me to marry that man for money," I said, pointing at Amos, who was now being detained for questioning as well. The officers took notes, their faces grim. The greed that had poisoned my home was finally being dragged out into the light. Martha started crying, begging me to tell the police it was all a mistake. "Elara, we are family. Tell them Silas didn't mean it," she wailed. I looked at her, remembering the scraps of food, the cold shed, and the way she watched him burn my letter without saying a word. "Family doesn't burn dreams, Martha," I said firmly. "Family doesn't sell their daughters to the blacksmith." The officers led Silas and Martha out of the house and into the back of the SUVs. The villagers had gathered around the gate, whispering and pointing. They had all watched my suffering for years, too afraid of Silas to speak up. Now, they watched him being taken away in shame. Dr. Thorne stayed with me, helping me gather my few belongings from the shed. When he saw the straw mat and the cracks in the walls, he shook his head. "No more of this," he promised. "You are coming with us today. Your dormitory is already prepared, and your father's estate will be placed under the university's legal protection until you are of age." As I packed my father's silver watch and my few clothes into a small bag, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The house that had felt like a prison was now just a collection of wood and stone. I walked out to the SUV, my head held high. Mr. Gable was standing at the edge of the crowd, and I ran to him, giving him a hug. "Thank you," I whispered. He patted my shoulder. "Go and change the world, Elara. You were always too big for this village." I climbed into the back of the vehicle next to Dr. Thorne. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. I saw the empty porch and the gray ash from the fireplace being blown away by the wind. The greedy stepbrother who thought he could burn my future was gone. My journey was finally beginning, and the road ahead was bright, wide, and paved with the books Silas tried to stop me from reading. I was no longer a servant. I was a scholar. The drive to the city was long, but I didn't mind. For the first time, I looked at the passing trees and the distant mountains without feeling like they were the walls of a cage. Dr. Thorne explained that the university had a legal team that handled cases of educational interference. He told me that my story was shocking, but sadly not unique. There are many who fear the power of an educated woman, he said. He assured me that Silas would face a judge within the week and that my testimony would be crucial. I wasn't afraid to speak the truth anymore. The truth was my shield. We arrived at the campus late in the evening. The buildings were tall and made of stone, with large windows that glowed like lanterns in the dark. It was more beautiful than any mansion I had imagined. As we walked through the gates, I felt a surge of energy. This was my world now. This was where I belonged. The air smelled of old paper and rain, a scent far better than the smoke of a fireplace. My dormitory room was small but perfect. It had a real bed with soft blankets, a desk of my own, and a bookshelf that was waiting to be filled. That first night, I slept for 10 hours straight without waking up once from the cold. When I woke up, there was a knock on the door. It was a student mentor named Elena. She brought me a stack of new textbooks and a laptop provided by the scholarship. "Welcome to the family, Elara," she said with a bright smile. I touched the screen of the laptop, marveling at the technology. I spent the morning learning how to use it, feeling like a traveler in a new land. I realized that Silas hadn't just tried to take my money, he had tried to keep me in the dark ages. He wanted me to be ignorant so I would be easy to control. But every word I read and every page I turned was a strike against his shadow. I was finally free to grow. A week later, I traveled back to the regional court for the hearing. I wore a new suit the university had purchased for me. When I walked into the courtroom, I saw Silas sitting behind a wooden table. He looked small without his heavy coat and his position of power in the village. He glared at me, but I didn't flinch. I stood in the witness box and told the judge everything. I told him about the day the letter arrived, the smell of the burning paper, and the marriage contract Silas tried to force me to sign. I spoke about the years of labor and the cold shed. The courtroom was silent as I spoke. Even the judge looked moved by my words. Silas's lawyer tried to argue that it was a traditional upbringing, but the judge cut him off. "There is nothing traditional about arson and extortion," the judge declared. Silas was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Martha was given 3 years of probation and community service. Justice was finally served. After the trial, I returned to the university with a light heart. I threw myself into my studies, choosing to major in law and social justice. I wanted to make sure that no other girl in a village like Oakhaven would ever have to go through what I did. I spent my afternoons in the library, surrounded by the very books Silas mocked. I learned about rights, about property, and about the power of the written word. I became a top student in my class, fueled by the memory of that Tuesday morning. Every time I felt tired or overwhelmed, I thought of the ash in the fireplace and found new strength. Dr. Thorne became a mentor to me, often checking in to see how I was adjusting. "You are a natural, Elara," he told me after I won my first mock trial. I realized that Silas was right about one thing: I was better than the life he tried to give me. But he was wrong to think that was a crime. Years passed, and I graduated at the top of my class. On my graduation day, I stood on the stage in my cap and gown, looking out at the crowd. Dr. Thorne was there, beaming with pride. Mr. Gable had traveled from the village to see me walk. I held my diploma tightly, knowing it was a document that no one could ever burn. I had transformed the pain of my past into a career dedicated to helping others. I started a foundation called the Letter Project, which provides legal aid to students whose families try to block their education. We have helped hundreds of girls escape forced marriages and reclaim their futures. I eventually went back to Oakhaven, not as a victim, but as a successful woman. I bought my father's old house back from the state and turned it into a community library. I wanted the smell of books to replace the smell of smoke in that town forever. I visited Silas in prison once, shortly before his release. He looked old and tired, the fire of his greed finally extinguished by the reality of his actions. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "I thought I could stop you," he muttered. I looked at him through the glass partition. "You thought you were burning a piece of paper, Silas. But you were actually lighting a fire under me." I didn't hate him anymore. Hate takes too much energy, and I had a world to build. I left the prison and drove back to my office in the city. My life was full of purpose and joy. I had a family of my own now, friends, colleagues, and students who respected me. I still have the charred corner of that first admission letter, framed on my office wall. It serves as a reminder that even from the ashes, something beautiful can grow. The greedy stepbrother tried to end my story, but he only succeeded in making the beginning more powerful. I often think about that day the dean arrived with the police. It was the moment my life split in two, the before and the after. In the before, I was a girl defined by what others took from her. In the after, I am a woman defined by what she gives to the world. I remember the flashing lights and the way the fog cleared as the SUVs drove into Oakhaven. It wasn't just a rescue, it was an awakening. I learned that when you fight for your dreams, the universe has a way of sending reinforcements. Whether it's a kind teacher like Mr. Gable or a dean with a police escort, help arrives for those who refuse to stay silent. I am proud of that girl who stood in the kitchen and told Silas she wasn't a goat. She was the one who started this whole journey. She was the one who survived the fire. My father's silver watch still ticks on my wrist every day. It reminds me that time is precious and that we must use it to stand up for what is right. Silas wanted to sell it for a few coins, but to me, it is priceless. It connects me to the man who believed in me before the world tried to break me. I know he would be proud of the library in Oakhaven. He would be proud to see children sitting on the porch where I once scrubbed the floors, lost in stories of adventure and hope. The village is changing. More girls are going to school now, and the traditional ways of Silas and Martha are fading into the past. Education is the great equalizer, and once the light is turned on, the darkness can never fully return. I am honored to be a part of that light. Looking back, the greed of my stepbrother was a heavy burden, but it gave me the strength to lift mountains. If my life had been easy, I might not have worked as hard or cared as much about justice. Silas thought he was my enemy, but in a strange way, he was the obstacle that taught me how to jump. He tried to burn my wings, but he only taught me how to fly through the flames. I am Elara Vance, and my story didn't end in a fireplace in Oakhaven. It began there. Every time I see a student open an admission letter, I see the look of hope in their eyes, and I know that I am doing exactly what I was meant to do. The fire is gone, the ash has settled, and the future is mine to write. To anyone reading my story, remember this: your value does not disappear because someone fails to see it. Your dreams are yours, and no one has the right to take them from you. If someone tries to burn your letter, find a teacher, find a friend, or find your own voice and scream until the world listens. Justice may take time, and it may arrive with flashing lights and a police escort, but it will arrive. Stay strong, keep your head up, and never let the fire of others put out the light inside of you. Silas is a memory, but my education is a legacy. I walked out of that gate with nothing but a bag and a charred dream, and today, I have everything. The dean arrived just in time, but the courage to wait for him was all mine. My story is proof that the pen is always mightier than the flame.